There are moments in your life that act as a hinge, swinging a door open into a room you never knew existed. They don't announce themselves with trumpets or a crash of thunder. They arrive silently, disguised as something ordinary, something forgettable. A Tuesday night. The low drone of a documentary about deep-sea life. The scent of rain on cooling asphalt drifting through an open window. For me, that moment was the specific, solid weight of Julian's head resting on my shoulder, his breathing having finally deepened into the slow, rhythmic cadence of sleep. The door to that new room hadn't just been opened. I felt as if I had been quietly, irrevocably, pushed inside, and the latch had clicked softly shut behind me. He was a continent of warmth against my side, a living, breathing landmass I had only ever been allowed to orbit. And now, through some seismic shift in our shared tectonics, he had drifted and settled against me. His arm, heavy with the dense, sculpted muscle of a swimmer, was draped loosely across my stomach, his fingers curled just above my hip. I could feel the faint, pulsing beat of his life through the thin cotton of my shirt, a drumbeat that seemed to be counting down the seconds of my own composure. I sat perfectly still, a statue carved from anxiety and a desperate, aching tenderness. My entire world had been reduced to the points of contact between our bodies, a cartography of forbidden territory suddenly, inexplicably, mapped out upon my own skin. I had spent years perfecting the art of loving Julian from a safe and silent distance. It was a craft I had honed in the bright, chlorinated air of the university natatorium, through the viewfinder of my camera, where I could study him without suspicion. I could catalog the way water beaded on the sharp lines of his shoulders, the determined set of his jaw before a race, the easy, unthinking grace with which he moved through the world. My camera lens was both a window and a shield, allowing me to capture his light while protecting me from the beautiful, dangerous heat of it. Friendship was the architecture we had built around this unspoken thing inside me. It was a sturdy, reliable structure with clearly defined rooms and hallways. We were roommates, best friends. He had a girlfriend, a life path that ran parallel to mine, but was never meant to intersect. I had my photography, my quiet corners, and the carefully guarded fortress of my own heart. I understood the rules. But this was a breach of every unspoken treaty we had ever abided by. This wasn't the casual, boisterous contact of teammates or the brief, incidental brush of two people sharing a small apartment. This was the quiet, deliberate intimacy of surrender. He had been talking, his voice growing slower, softer, as the documentary narrator spoke of bioluminescent creatures in the crushing dark. He'd been recounting some frustrating story about a bug in the code he was working on, the words beginning to slur together, and then the monologue had simply faded out. A long silence followed, and I had assumed he was just lost in thought. Then came the slow, heavy lean, a gradual transfer of weight so gentle I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, until his head found its final resting place in the curve of my neck and shoulder, and he let out a soft, trusting sigh that vibrated straight through my bones. My own breathing had hitched, caught somewhere in my throat. I was terrified to move, terrified to even exhale too loudly, lest I break the spell and send him retreating back to his side of the couch, back to the safe and separate landmass he was supposed to be. An internal war raged within me. One part of my brain, the logical, self-preservationist part, screamed at me to shift, to gently nudge him awake, to re-establish the boundaries he had so innocently crossed. It warned me that this was a moment built on sand, a fleeting comfort for him that would become a cornerstone of painful hope for me. It told me that to allow this was to invite a specific kind of heartbreak, the kind that comes from being mistaken for a pillow, a temporary harbor in a moment of exhaustion. But the other part of me, the part that had been starving for this for years, was a traitor. It silenced the alarms with a whisper. It told me to stay, to just be still, to absorb the warmth, the weight, the reality of him, because a moment like this might never come again. It was a dangerous, reckless voice, and it was the one I chose to listen to. I remained motionless, a willing prisoner, while the television cast shifting blue light across his sleeping face, and I felt the profound, terrifying, and exquisite agony of getting everything I had ever wanted, all under the guise of a complete and utter mistake. It had all started with the smell of chlorine and the relentless, percussive sound of water being sliced apart by powerful, practiced limbs. I was not a swimmer. I was the opposite of a swimmer. I was a creature of stillness, of quiet observation. My natural habitat was the darkroom, the library, the shadowed corner of a room where I could watch the world unfold without being a part of its chaotic motion. I had a scholarship for photography, and one of my first assignments for the university paper was to cover the swim team's opening meet. I went with a sense of detached duty, expecting to capture a few generic action shots and be done with it. But then I saw him. Julian. He was different from the others. While many of his teammates moved with a kind of brute force, Julian moved through the water as if he belonged to it. He didn't fight the medium, he merged with it. It was a violent ballet of muscle and grace, and through my long lens, I felt like I was seeing something private, something elemental. I spent the rest of that season documenting the team, but really, I was documenting him. I learned his rhythms, the slight dip of his shoulder before he launched himself from the starting block, the way he'd slick his wet hair back with both hands after removing his cap, the brief, unguarded moment of exhaustion on his face before the mask of easy confidence slipped back into place. My photos of him were technically proficient, earning me praise from my professors and the sports editor, but for me, they were something else entirely. They were a secret collection of stolen intimacies. Each frame was a confession I would never speak. He was the sun-drenched subject, and I was the shadowed observer, a dynamic that felt both natural and deeply, painfully permanent. We didn't actually speak for months. I was just the quiet, lanky photo kid who was always on the pool deck. He was Julian, the team captain, the anchor of the relay, the guy everyone seemed to know and gravitate towards. He radiated a kind of effortless warmth that I, with my carefully constructed walls, found both mesmerizing and intimidating. The first time he spoke to me, it was to ask for a print of a photo I'd taken. It was a shot of him mid-stroke, his face half submerged, one eye fixed on the end of the lane with an almost frightening intensity. He didn't just say he liked it. He told me I'd captured the quiet part, the internal focus he could never explain to people. He saw that I had seen him, not just the athlete, and in that moment, a bridge formed across the chasm of our different worlds. From there, a friendship bloomed, improbable and deep. We were an odd pairing. He was the kinetic energy, I was the potential. He pulled me into his orbit of late-night food runs with the team, study groups where he'd inevitably get distracted and start telling stories, and victory parties that I mostly endured from a quiet corner. In turn, I offered him a space of calm. He'd come to the darkroom sometimes, fascinated by the slow, magical process of an image appearing on paper in the shallow chemical bath. He said my quiet didn't feel empty, it felt full. He'd talk, and I would listen, a role I was far more comfortable with. He talked about the immense pressure to perform, the grueling early morning practices, and his long-term, long-distance girlfriend from high school, Sarah. Sarah was a constant presence in his life, a name that was spoken with a comfortable, familiar affection. She was part of his architecture, a foundational element of the life he was building. When she was mentioned, I would retreat further into my role as the supportive, platonic friend. I learned to perfect a neutral expression, to offer the right kind of advice, to treat his relationship as a sacred, untouchable thing. It was a form of self-preservation. To acknowledge the sharp, twisting pang in my chest whenever he spoke of their future together would have been to acknowledge the utter hopelessness of my own feelings. And that was a truth I was not prepared to face. So I buried it, deep under layers of friendship and feigned indifference. After graduation, our paths diverged and then, surprisingly, reconverged. He got a demanding job as a software engineer in the city, and I was trying to make it as a freelance photographer, which mostly meant I was shooting uninspired corporate events and barely making rent. When the lease on my shoebox apartment was up, he was the one who suggested we get a place together. His reasoning was purely practical. His own roommate was moving out, We'd save money. We got along well. It made perfect sense. For him, it was a logical solution. For me, it was a terrifying, irresistible proposition. Living with Julian meant constant, daily exposure to the one person who could unravel me with a single, thoughtless smile. It was like agreeing to live in a house where the sun shone day and night, beautiful and brilliant, but with nowhere to find shade. I said yes, of course. And so we built a new life, a domestic version of our college friendship. The apartment became our shared space, a delicate ecosystem of his chaotic energy and my quiet order. His swim medals hung next to my framed photographs. His protein powder shared a shelf with my collection of teas. We fell into a comfortable rhythm of takeout dinners, arguments over what to watch on television, and long talks late at night when the city outside had finally grown quiet. He was still with Sarah, their relationship now a complex negotiation of weekend visits and 5-year plans. I remained the steadfast friend, the keeper of his secrets, the person he came to when he needed to vent about work or his relationship. I had accepted my place in his life. I was the constant, the background, the reliable foundation upon which the more important structures of his world were built. I had convinced myself that it was enough. It had to be enough. And it was, until that Tuesday night, when he fell asleep on my shoulder and the sturdy, reliable architecture of our friendship suddenly felt as fragile as glass, threatening to shatter with a single, wrong move. The shift, when it came, was not a sudden earthquake, but a slow, grinding erosion. It began with a phone call on a Wednesday afternoon. I was in the middle of editing a soul-crushing set of photos from a dental conference, endless images of smiling people in polo shirts, when my phone buzzed with his name. I answered with a cheerful, "Hey, what's up?" expecting him to ask what I wanted for dinner. But the voice on the other end was not the Julian I knew. It was a hollowed-out version, thin and frayed at the edges. "She ended it," he said, and those 3 words carried the weight of a collapsed building. There was no need to ask who she was or what it was. Sarah, their relationship, the 5-year plan, the entire future he had so carefully mapped out. It was all gone. "I'm coming home," I said, my own voice sounding distant, as if it belonged to someone else. I closed my laptop, ignoring the sea of unnaturally white teeth on the screen, and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving a half-finished cup of tea behind. My role in that moment was clear. I was the best friend. My job was to be the anchor, the steady presence in his storm. But as I navigated the crowded city streets, a vile, treacherous feeling coiled in the pit of my stomach. It was a tiny, flickering ember of hope, and I was disgusted with myself for it. His world was falling apart, and a dark, selfish part of me whispered, "Now what?" I shoved the feeling down, buried it deep, and focused on the task at hand. Be a friend. Just be a friend. When I got back to the apartment, I found him sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at a framed photo of him and Sarah on his nightstand. He looked smaller, diminished, as if the news had physically stolen some of his substance. He didn't seem to have the energy to be hysterical or even to cry. He was just empty. He explained it to me in a monotone, the words detached and clinical. She had met someone else. Someone local. It was easier. She was sorry. It was a story as old as time, but for him, it was a unique and devastating apocalypse. He wasn't just losing his girlfriend. He was losing his compass, the fixed point around which his entire adult life had been oriented. In the days and weeks that followed, I moved through our apartment with a quiet, careful purpose. I became a curator of comfort. I made sure there was always food in the fridge, even if he had no appetite. I put on movies he liked, mindless action films that required no emotional investment. I listened when he wanted to talk, which wasn't often, and I sat with him in silence when he didn't, which was most of the time. I learned the different textures of his grief. There was the angry grief, which manifested in punishingly long workouts at the gym, from which he would return exhausted and grim. There was the hollow grief, where he would stare into space for hours, lost in a landscape I couldn't see. And then there was the most difficult kind, the lonely grief, which descended in the evenings, when the distractions of the day fell away and the silence of the apartment became a roaring void. It was this loneliness that began to change the geography of our living space. The unspoken boundaries we had always maintained started to dissolve. He had always been the more physically demonstrative of the two of us, prone to a clap on the back or a one-armed hug after a good day. But this was different. He started seeking proximity not with energy, but with a kind of weary, magnetic pull. Our evenings, which had once been spent on opposite ends of the sofa, each engrossed in our own laptops or books, now found us closer together. He would sit nearer, his leg occasionally brushing against mine, a contact that would send a jolt through my system that I had to consciously ignore. He was a ship that had lost its moorings, and he was drifting, seeking any port in the storm. I happened to be the closest one. I told myself it meant nothing. It was a natural response to emotional trauma. He needed comfort. He needed the steady, reassuring presence of his best friend. My body was just a convenient, warm object, a substitute for the comfort he had lost. I repeated this to myself like a mantra, a shield against the dangerous interpretations my heart was so eager to make. I was his friend. I was being a good friend. To assign any other meaning to his actions would be predatory, a selfish twisting of his vulnerability to fit my own secret narrative. I had to be careful. I had to be safe. For him. For me. But every time he closed the distance between us by another inch, every time his hand rested on the cushion a little too close to my own, the lines I had drawn for myself became fainter, harder to see in the dim, shifting light of our shared living room. The erosion had begun, and I was powerless to stop the slow, inevitable collapse of my own defenses. The ritual began, as most life-altering habits do, by accident. It was a Friday night, about a month after the breakup. Julian had had a particularly brutal week at work, and the exhaustion was etched into the lines around his eyes. We were watching some sprawling, critically acclaimed film that I was deeply invested in, and he was clearly struggling to follow. He had tried to engage, asking a few questions in the first half hour, but his contributions dwindled until there was only the sound of the film and our synchronized breathing. I was aware of him beside me, a solid presence in my peripheral vision, but my focus was on the screen. Then I felt it, the slow, gradual lean, the final, soft weight of his head on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid, every nerve ending fired at once. It was the moment from that first Tuesday, replayed. But this time, it felt different. Less like an accident, more like an inevitability. My first instinct was still panic, the primal urge to pull away, to reset the world to its proper alignment. But I fought it down. I remembered the last time, his deep, untroubled sleep. He was exhausted. He was grieving. This was not about me. I took a slow, silent breath and forced my muscles to relax, to accept the weight. The film continued to play, but I no longer saw it. My entire consciousness had collapsed into the square inches of my shoulder where his head rested. I could feel the silkiness of his hair against my neck, smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. It was the most exquisite torture I had ever known. He slept for the entire second half of the movie, and I did not move a single muscle. When the credits rolled and the room was plunged into silence, I waited. After a minute, he stirred, lifting his head with a soft, groggy sound. He blinked at me, his eyes unfocused. "Oh," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "Sorry. Must have drifted off." He didn't seem embarrassed, just tired. He stood up, stretched, and mumbled a good night before shuffling off to his room, leaving me alone on the couch, my shoulder feeling both strangely cold and searingly hot, as if it had been branded. I thought that would be the end of it, a one-time anomaly born of stress and sorrow. I was wrong. The following Sunday, it happened again. This time, we were watching a stupid comedy, and he was laughing along with me. But as the movie wore on, I felt him shifting, drawing closer. There was a deliberation to it this time that hadn't been there before. He adjusted a cushion behind him, then another, until he was angled towards me. And then, with a sigh that seemed both weary and content, he settled his head in the exact same spot. This time, my panic was less acute, replaced by a kind of dizzying, terrified wonder. This was not an accident. This was a choice. His choice. He was choosing, consciously or not, to find comfort in me, with me. His arm found its way across my lap, his hand resting on my thigh. It was a casual, possessive gesture, the kind of unthinking intimacy I had seen him share with Sarah 100 times. On me, it felt like a lightning strike. I looked down at his hand, at the long, capable fingers resting so easily on my leg, and I felt my carefully constructed walls begin to crumble into dust. This became our new normal. 2 or 3 nights a week, we would end up on the couch, and at some point, he would gravitate towards me, using my body as his anchor. It became a silent, choreographed dance. I learned to anticipate the moment, the subtle shift in his posture, the slowing of his breath. I learned to arrange the cushions in a way that would make it more comfortable for him. I learned to sit perfectly still for hours, my own needs, a glass of water, a trip to the bathroom, becoming secondary to the preservation of this fragile, sacred bubble. My apartment, once my sanctuary of solitude, was transformed. The living room became a liminal space, a territory of breathtaking ambiguity. Was I a friend, or was I a human-shaped tranquilizer, a source of convenient, non-threatening physical comfort? My internal monologue during these evenings was a chaotic symphony of warring voices. I would analyze his every movement, every sigh, every twitch of his fingers, searching for meaning, for intent. When his breathing was deep and even, I would tell myself it was purely platonic, that I was no different from a comfortable pillow. But then, in the space between sleep and waking, he would sometimes make a small sound, a soft murmur, and shift even closer, nuzzling his face into my neck, and the hope I was trying so desperately to suppress would surge through me, hot and undeniable. I was living a double life. Outwardly, I was the calm, supportive friend. Inwardly, I was a seismologist, meticulously recording the tremors of our interactions, trying to predict the earthquake I both feared and craved. The ritual escalated in increments so small they were almost imperceptible. First, it was just his head on my shoulder. Then, his arm across my stomach. A few weeks later, he began to fall asleep fully leaned against me, his entire side pressed to mine, his legs tangled with my own. One night, he was particularly restless, troubled by a nightmare, his limbs twitching. In his sleep, he reached out, his hand fumbling until it found mine. He laced his fingers through my own, his grip surprisingly strong, and his restlessness ceased. He fell back into a deep, peaceful sleep, holding my hand. I stared at our joined hands for what felt like an eternity, the sight so impossibly domestic, so profoundly intimate, that it made my heart ache with a fierce, painful joy. I was living on a knife's edge between bliss and devastation. Each night was a gift, a temporary reprieve from my loneliness. But each morning brought the inevitable reset, where he would wake up, pull away, and we would become two separate people again, making coffee in the kitchen and talking about the weather as if our bodies had not been intimately intertwined just hours before. This routine was both my sanctuary and my torment, a beautiful, unsustainable fiction that I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, was destined to have a final, heartbreaking chapter. The crossing happened on a Thursday in late October. A persistent, dreary rain had been falling all day, sealing the city under a dome of gray. The sound of it against the window panes was a constant, soothing rhythm, isolating our apartment from the rest of the world. It felt as if we were the only two people left. Julian had been quiet all evening, not a sad quiet, but a contemplative one. He seemed less like a man adrift, and more like a man charting a new course, his brow furrowed in concentration. We had ordered pizza and put on a movie, one of my favorites, a slow, atmospheric film with more silence than dialogue. By now, the ritual was so ingrained that it began almost as soon as the opening credits started. He settled against me without hesitation, a familiar, welcome weight. But tonight felt different. The air was charged with a new kind of tension. He wasn't asleep. I knew because his breathing never deepened into that slow, steady rhythm. His hand rested on my chest, and I could feel the faint, nervous tap of his thumb against my sternum, a Morse code I couldn't decipher. We watched the entire 2-hour film like that, him pressed against me, awake and silent, his thumb tapping out its secret message against my bones. I was hyper-aware of everything. The warmth of his palms soaking through my shirt, the way his hair tickled my chin, the subtle shifts of his body as he reacted to the film. The silence in the room was immense, filled with all the things we had never said to each other. When the movie ended, the credits rolled in silence, a stark white text on a black screen. The only light in the room was the pale, shifting glow from the television. He didn't move. I didn't move. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the steady tap of his thumb. It felt like the moment after a deep breath is taken, the world holding itself in suspense, waiting for the exhale. He was the one who broke the stillness. He shifted, not away, but up, propping himself on one elbow so he could look at me. His face was only inches from mine, his features softened and made mysterious by the dim light. I could see the flicker of the screen reflected in his eyes. "Leo," he said, and his voice was a low whisper, a sound that seemed to be absorbed by the quiet of the room. "Yeah." I managed to breathe out, my own voice tight and unsteady. He just looked at me for a long moment, his gaze searching my face as if he were trying to read a difficult passage of text. His thumb had stopped its tapping. His hand was just resting, warm and heavy, over my heart. I could feel my pulse thudding against his palm, a wild, frantic bird trapped in a cage, betraying all my carefully guarded secrets. I was certain he could feel it, certain he knew everything. The thought was both terrifying and, in a strange way, liberating. "Can I?" He started, then stopped. He swallowed, and I watched the motion in the column of his throat. "Can I try something?" The question hung in the air between us, fragile and immense. It was a question of permission, of consent, an acknowledgement that a line was about to be crossed, and he would not cross it without my assent. He was giving me an out, a chance to say no, to retreat to the safety of our established friendship. I could have laughed and deflected, made a joke, and the moment would have passed, leaving us wounded but intact. But I was so tired of being safe. I was so tired of the silence. I didn't trust my voice, so I just nodded. A single, small, jerky movement. It was all the answer he needed. He leaned in slowly, giving me every possible second to change my mind, to pull away. I didn't. I met him halfway. The first touch of his lips to mine was impossibly soft, hesitant, and questioning. It wasn't a kiss of passion or of pent-up demand. It was a kiss of discovery. It was a confession. It tasted of salt and rain and a quiet, profound relief. It was the sound of a door, which I had been staring at for years, finally, gently, swinging open. I brought my hand up to cup the back of his neck, my fingers tangling in his hair, and the kiss deepened, becoming something more certain, an answer to a question I hadn't even realized I had been asking for my entire life. In the flickering blue light of the silent television, the world I had known dissolved, and a new one, terrifying and beautiful, began to take its shape. The aftermath was not the gentle, sun-drenched landscape I might have foolishly imagined. It was a cold, gray dawn, thick with an unnerving silence. I woke up on the couch alone, a blanket tucked around me that I didn't remember pulling over myself. The apartment was still, too still. A quick glance told me Julian's bedroom door was closed. I had a fleeting, hopeful thought that he was just sleeping in, but then my phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text from him, sent over an hour ago. Had to go in early for a meeting. About last night. "I'm sorry. I'm just really confused right now." Each word was a perfectly aimed stone, and together they shattered the fragile, beautiful thing we had built the night before. Confused. Sorry. These were not the words of a man stepping into a new, wonderful reality. They were the words of a man regretting a mistake. The warmth that had filled me just hours ago evaporated, replaced by an icy, creeping dread. I had misinterpreted everything. I had been a fool. He hadn't been reaching for me. He had just been flailing in his grief, and I was the nearest object to grab onto. The kiss wasn't a beginning. It was an aberration, a symptom of his loneliness that he was now, in the clear light of day, deeply regretting. The shame was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread from my chest to my face. I felt naive, predatory even, for having met his confusion with such certainty. The next few days were a masterclass in avoidance. He came home late and left early. We, who had shared a living space with the easy intimacy of brothers, now moved like ghosts around each other. The apartment, once our shared sanctuary, felt like a minefield. Every surface held a memory of the intimacy we had shared, and now they seemed to mock me. The couch was the worst, a silent monument to my own stupidity. We communicated through brief, polite text messages about bills and groceries. The cavernous silence that had been so full of tension and possibility before the kiss was now just empty, aching with unspoken regret and awkwardness. I was devastated. The pain was a dull, constant ache behind my ribs. It wasn't just the pain of rejection, but the agony of having lost my best friend. I had traded the steady, reliable comfort of our friendship for a few moments of impossible bliss, and the cost was proving to be unbearable. I cycled through a storm of emotions: heartbreak, anger, embarrassment, and a profound, bone-deep sadness. I was angry at him for his cowardice, for initiating something he was not brave enough to face. But mostly, I was angry at myself for allowing that tiny, treacherous ember of hope to catch fire. I should have known better. I should have protected myself. I should have protected him from his own temporary lapse in judgment. After nearly a week of this Cold War, I knew I couldn't take it anymore. The silence was more corrosive than any argument could ever be. If our friendship was truly over, if what we had was broken beyond repair, I needed to hear it from him. I needed to know for certain, so I could begin the long, arduous process of grieving it and moving on. I couldn't live in this limbo, this purgatory of unanswered questions and averted gazes. The quiet observer had to finally step out of the shadows and speak. I waited for him that evening. I didn't turn on the television. I just sat in a chair across from the couch, the room lit by a single lamp, and waited. When he finally came home, he stopped short in the doorway of the living room, seeing me. His shoulders slumped, the posture of a man walking to his own execution. He looked tired, more tired than I had ever seen him, with dark circles under his eyes. "We have to talk, Julian," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. My hands were clenched into fists in my lap, my nails digging into my palms. He nodded slowly, not meeting my eyes. He dropped his bag by the door and walked over to the couch. Our couch, but he didn't sit. He just stood there, looking at it, as if it were a crime scene. "I know," he said, his voice rough. "Leo, I am so sorry. I never should have. I messed everything up. You're my best friend, and I crossed a line. It was selfish and unfair to you." His words, meant as an apology, felt like a dismissal. He was framing it as a moment of weakness, a violation of our friendship. He was trying to put things back in the box they had been in before, but he didn't realize the box was already shattered. Was that what it was? I asked, and my voice cracked, betraying the emotion I was trying so hard to control. A crossed line. A mistake? Because from where I was sitting, Julian, it felt like anything but. I finally stood up, unable to remain seated any longer. "For God's sake, look at me." He finally lifted his head, and his eyes were filled with a torment that mirrored my own. I saw confusion, yes, but I also saw fear. He looked like a man terrified of his own reflection. "You can't just kiss me like that, after everything, after all these weeks of leaning on me, of sleeping in my arms, and then tell me you're just confused," I said, the words tumbling out, fueled by a week of pain and silence. "That's not fair. I deserve more than that. I deserve to know what's going on in your head, even if it's something I don't want to hear. But you have to say it. You have to stop hiding." He flinched, but he didn't look away. "I don't know what's going on in my head," he confessed, his voice breaking. "That's the problem. All I know is that for the last 2 months, the only place I've felt safe, the only place the world stopped spinning, is on that couch, next to you. And I leaned into it. It was easy. It was comfort. But then, it wasn't just comfort anymore. It became something else. Something I wanted. And that night, I wanted to kiss you. I really, really wanted to, he took a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of pure frustration. And the second I did, I panicked. Because what does that mean, Leo? My whole life, I've been one thing. I loved Sarah. I was going to marry her. That was my life. And now this. You. It doesn't fit into any box I know how to build. It scares the hell out of me. And I was so scared of what it meant that I hurt you. And that's the part one can't forgive. I ran because I was a coward, and I left you to deal with the wreckage. That's what I'm sorry for. Not for the kiss, but for everything that came after. His confession hung in the air, raw and painful, and, finally, honest. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified. He wasn't dismissing what had happened. He was overwhelmed by it. The anger in my chest began to dissipate, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He was just as lost as I was, only he hadn't had years to navigate this territory within himself. He had been dropped into it without a map, and he was panicking. The silence that returned was different. It wasn't empty or awkward. It was heavy with the weight of his honesty, a foundation upon which something new, something real, might possibly be built. We stood there for a long time, caught in the gravity of his admission. The architecture of our relationship lay in ruins around us, and for the first time, I saw it not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. The old structure had been confining, built on unspoken truths and careful omissions. Now, the ground was cleared. We could build something new, if we were brave enough. I took a deep breath, the first truly steady one I'd taken in a week. You know, I began, my voice softer now. I was never confused. Julian looked at me, his expression shifting from tormented to questioning. What do you mean? This feeling? For you, it isn't new for me, Julian, I said, and the confession felt like releasing a weight I had been carrying for a third of my life. I fell in love with you through a camera lens when I was 19 years old. I just got very, very good at hiding it. I built my life around hiding it. Our friendship, this apartment, it was all something I cherished, but it was also a place for me to keep this part of myself safe and secret. So when you started leaning on me, it was everything I had ever wanted and everything I was terrified of. And when you kissed me, it wasn't confusing. It was an answer to a question I thought I was going to have to hold inside me forever. The look on his face was one of dawning, staggering comprehension. He was seeing the entire history of our friendship recontextualized, viewing years of shared moments through this new lens. He saw the quiet observer not as passive, but as patient. He saw the steady friend not as platonic, but as devoted. A million small gestures, 1,000 quiet moments, suddenly clicked into place for him. I could see it happening behind his eyes. All this time, he whispered, his voice filled with a kind of awe. Leo, why didn't you ever say anything? I gave a small, sad smile. You were happy. You had a life, a plan. You were my best friend. How could I risk destroying all of that for something I was sure you could never feel back? It was better to have you as a friend than to not have you at all. He closed the distance between us in 2 long strides. He didn't kiss me. He did something far more intimate. He gently took my face in his hands, his thumbs stroking my cheekbones, his gaze unwavering. His hands were warm and steady. I am such an idiot, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I've been so wrapped up in my own fear, in what I was supposed to be, that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. I'm not confused about you, Leo. I'm scared. There's a difference. I'm scared of figuring this out, of what people will think, of what it all means. But the one thing I'm not confused about, the one thing that has felt more real than anything else in the last few months, is this. He gestured between us, to the space that was no longer empty, but filled with a powerful, palpable connection. I don't know what to call it. I don't know what it looks like, but I don't want to run from it anymore. And I definitely don't want to do it without you. Relief washed over me, so potent and overwhelming it almost brought me to my knees. It was more than I could have hoped for. It wasn't a promise of a perfect future, but a promise to try. A promise to be brave together. Okay, I whispered. Okay, we can be scared together. That night, the ritual changed. After we had talked for hours, hashing out years of unspoken feelings and weeks of painful misunderstanding, we found ourselves back on the couch. It was late, the city outside now deeply asleep. Exhaustion had settled over us, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that comes after a long and necessary journey. He looked at me, a question in his eyes. I answered by patting the cushion next to me. He lay down, and this time, I was the one who initiated the contact. I stretched out beside him and pulled his head onto my shoulder, wrapping my arms around him. He settled against me with a sigh, not of weariness, but of pure, unadulterated contentment. He was home. We were home. There was no ambiguity, no analysis, no fear. There was only the quiet, certain comfort of two people who had finally found their way to the same place. In the weeks and months that followed, we began to build our new life. It was a slow, deliberate process of learning and unlearning. We had to unlearn the habits of platonic friendship, the careful distances, the unspoken boundaries. And we had to learn the new language of us. It was a language spoken not in grand declarations, but in small, quiet gestures. It was in the way he would now reach for my hand without pretext while we were watching a movie. It was in the way I would bring him a cup of coffee in the morning and kiss his forehead before he was fully awake. It was in the shared, easy silence that was no longer a space of tension, but of deep, abiding peace. His bedroom door remained open. Then, eventually, it was rarely used at all. My bed, which had always felt far too large for one person, became our shared space. Waking up next to him was a daily miracle I never got used to. Seeing his face in the soft morning light, peaceful and unguarded, was a photograph I took with my mind every single day. We learned each other's sleeping rhythms, the way he would steal the blankets, the way I would wake up at the slightest noise. These small domestic intimacies were the bricks with which we built our new foundation, solid and true. We learned to talk, really talk. He told me about his fears, his lingering sadness over the end of his old life, and his surprising, thrilling excitement for this new, uncharted one. I told him about the years of quiet longing, the loneliness I had wrapped around myself like a protective cloak, and the profound, terrifying joy of finally being able to take it off. We were two cartographers, mapping out the previously hidden landscapes of each other's souls. There was no single moment that defined our resolution. It was a collection of hundreds of small, quiet moments that, when stitched together, created the fabric of our new reality. It was making dinner together, bumping hips in our small kitchen. It was me taking photos of him, not from a distance, but up close, capturing the laugh lines around his eyes that I now knew I had helped create. It was him, sitting on the floor of my darkroom, just watching me work, no longer just a fascinated observer, but a quiet, integral part of my world. The couch was still our place, but its meaning had been transformed. It was no longer a stage for my anxious vigil, but simply a place of comfort, of rest, of togetherness. We would still fall asleep there sometimes, tangled up in each other. But now, waking up was not an ending. It was just a continuation. I remember one Sunday morning, months later. We were in the kitchen, the room filled with the smell of coffee and the warm light of a new day. He was standing by the window, looking out at the city, and I was leaning against the counter, just watching him. He turned and caught my gaze, a slow, easy smile spreading across his face. He didn't say anything. He just walked over, wrapped his arms around my waist, and rested his chin on my shoulder, holding me from behind. We stood like that for a long time, watching the world wake up together. It's true that some moments in your life act as a hinge, swinging a door open into a new and unknown room. That night on the couch, the night of the first kiss, had certainly been one of them. But I learned that the most important moments are not always the ones where the door swings open. They are the quiet, deliberate moments that follow. They are the moments where you choose, again and again, to stay in that new room. They are the moments you spend exploring its corners, painting its walls, and filling it with a shared life. It wasn't about the one-time, dramatic crossing of a threshold. It was about the daily, conscious choice to build a home together in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned how to create.